On today's show, what if LeBron James had teamed up with James Harden and Chris Paul here on the Houston Rockets in the aftermath of the Rockets losing to the Golden State Warriors in the Western Conference Finals? What would that team have looked like? What would the Rockets have been able to accomplish with that trio? Would they have been title favorites with a trio of LeBron James, James Harden, and Chris Paul? We're going to break it all down for you coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays, host of the State of the Rockets podcast, as well as the founder of ClutchCityControlRoom.com. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin, and the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets. Joining us now for our multiversal Houston Rockets What If travels as we explore what could have possibly taken place with this team back during that faded offseason after the 2018 disappointment against the Golden State Warriors is none other than OG Rockets Twitter fan himself, a diehard Houston Rockets fan, and one of the biggest LOR fans out there, my guy, Raj Nair. Man, I'm happy to finally have you on the program, Raj.
I'm happy to be on finally, Jackson. I've been listening for, I think, 4 or 5 years now since Ben was on. And I remember when you got the gig, and I was pretty excited then. I'm pretty excited now. Well,
and you can follow this man on Twitter at Reezy Season for all of his Rockets musings, all of his we'll call them fiery hot takes, for all of his slander, whatever he's putting out there on the social media streets. Slander. But there we go, mostly slander. But Raj, we're gonna wind back the clock a little bit here because we're doing a what if episode, and the what if in question here is what if LeBron James teamed up with James Harden and Chris Paul here in Houston after that. Just we've talked about it a lot. We know how that Western Conference Finals run ended in 2018, the faded Game 7, the hamstring injury with Chris Paul, all of that. And going into that offseason, there was a lot of speculation about what does this team do, right? They were right there on the precipice of dethroning the Golden State Warriors, arguably one of the greatest teams ever assembled in basketball. And so it suddenly became the question, how do you go from that? How do you up the ante even further? What could you possibly add to a team that just won a franchise best 65 games? Still the best record in franchise history.
It was a good year.
It was an incredible year for Houston Rockets fans, an incredible year for basketball fans everywhere. That was one of the most entertaining Western Conference Finals in recent. That was really the finals, right? Because the Warriors went to the finals and they waxed LeBron and the Cavs. Mm-hmm. And so then we get to the offseason, and LeBron, right? His contract's up. He has a player option, effectively, right? So there's all this just looming, like, all right, what's going to happen? What's LeBron going to do, right? He's lost to the Warriors 3 out of 4 years in Cleveland. He finally brought a chip back to Cleveland. He achieved what he set out to do there. What was his next move going to be? And here in Houston, right, Chris Paul, one of LeBron's closest friends of all time, right? Suddenly we start connecting all these little dots, and we're thinking there's this possibility of LeBron James to Houston. And that's when stuff started really kind of firing off, and you started getting all the trades, all the hypotheticals, all the scenarios blowing up.
Yeah, so I think it came from the idea that we were both in a similar place, right? Like, we were getting blocked in the Western Conference by the Golden State Warriors. He was getting blocked in the finals. And once they added KD, I don't think any of those Cavs-Warriors series were close after that. And I think for the Rockets, when you've got a team as good as ours was in that year, in that season, setting franchise records, James Harden was MVP. I think that to up the ante, you really have to go for one of the top 5 players. And LeBron James was the obvious choice. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the proposed scenario was Eric Gordon in a sign-in trade for LeBron, right?
So the crazy thing was, it was kind of like the precedent was set the year prior with Chris Paul coming to the Rockets was the opt-in and trade. So it wasn't effectively a sign-in trade. It was LeBron would have opted into the final year of his contract, been traded to the Rockets. And I think the package at the time was something along the lines of Ryan Anderson, Eric Gordon, and then just a million first-round draft picks.
Right.
For LeBron.
And we know
James.
Morey had no intention of playing those draft picks. And I guess now we know he wasn't around or wasn't planning on being around to make those draft picks. But I think that trade, 10 times out of 10, you do that trade as the Rockets for LeBron James. Like, what team wouldn't have traded for LeBron? I mean, at like his third peak, but at one of his peaks in essentially I'd say right after the peak of his like prime years. Coming off of that incredible performance in the finals when he came back 3-1, right? Not the year before, but what was it? 2 years before. Yeah, to join a team that took the KD Warriors to 7. I think that for us, it made total sense to become the overwhelming favorites. For LeBron, I don't think any of us thought he was worried about damaging his legacy by joining a super team. He's already, he's done that before. He had the big 3 in Miami. He had a big 2.5 in Cleveland, but it was there. And I don't think any of us expected him to go to, or at least I didn't. I'll speak for myself. I didn't expect him to join the Lakers and miss the playoffs and blow a year of his prime, babysitting the Lakers. So yeah, I think it made total sense for both sides. I get the business interests that went into him moving to LA, maybe for his kids, maybe for his business reasons. But yeah, I think that was an obvious decision for both sides.
It would have created, and that's where some of the fun from this what if scenario comes from, and where we're going to explore what this would have looked like had it actually come together. It would have created easily one of the most dominant teams that you'd ever seen in NBA history, because you get the Houston Rockets, who had the best backcourt in the NBA at that point with Chris Paul and James Harden. James Harden coming off his MVP season, and then you add arguably the second greatest player of all time to that core. It doesn't matter who else you have left over, but even on top of that, they would have still had Clint Capella left over. They would have been able to add guys at the margins to really round out the rest of that roster. That would have immediately catapulted the Rockets. As hard as it is to imagine having a team that would have been better or more like the odds-on favorite to win a title past that iteration of the Golden State Warriors with Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Clay, Dre, that version of the Warriors, that version of the Rockets would, I think, have transcended, as far as at least odds favorites go. We can get into the different machinations of what that would have actually looked like with those 3 guys on the floor. And that's what we're going to do, because here in this timeline, right, we have a splintered off timeline here that we did not get to experience. But in this timeline, LeBron James is browsing schools in Houston. He's at Kincaid. He's looking at schools for his kids. Chris Paul's blowing him up on the phone every morning, noon and night. Calling him up saying, you got to come to Houston. You got to come to Houston. CP3 makes it happen. He delivers on the deal. Daryl Morey strikes the trade agreement. The Rockets send Eric Gordon, Ryan Anderson, and a million firsts and a million pick swaps to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and LeBron James opts into the final year of his deal, comes to the Houston Rockets. We're going to talk about what that would look like here in Houston in just one moment after a quick message from our friends over at NHTSA. Look, it can happen so easily. You're out with your friends, your coworkers, you're putting back a few drinks, a few becomes a few too many. It's time to go, and for a moment, you think of calling for a ride. Nah, you're a good driver, you live nearby, you can make it home okay. What are the odds you'll get pulled over? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? You lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone? It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. Drive sober or get pulled over. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Continuing to explore our what if scenario as we now have a fracture in the timeline in which we are exploring the idea of what would it have looked like had LeBron James joined the Houston Rockets that 2018 summer after the Rockets lost to the Warriors in Game 7. And in this timeline that we're now exploring, but LeBron James is now a Houston Rocket. It's happened. Daryl Morey made it happen. There is now a new big three in the NBA, and that is James Harden, Chris Paul, and LeBron James. Now, first off, that offseason, right, was the offseason, Raj, where the Rockets kind of, retooled sort of, right? They let Trevor Ariza walk, and it kind of felt like they brought in some names at the margins, Michael Carter-Williams, Carmelo Anthony, some interesting names to try and cobble together a team that, was going to have, at least aspirations of making it back to the Western Conference Finals or going back toe-to-toe with the Golden State Warriors. But they lost out on key contributors like Trevor Ariza and Luka Mbamute. So we look at what this would have done. So you add LeBron James, but now you're also missing out on Ryan Anderson, who wasn't a big part of that following team the following year, unfortunately. Basically lost his spot to PJ Tucker the year prior. But I think the biggest and probably the most underrated thing about this what if would be you lose Eric Gordon. And that's the scary part, is because now, even though you have a big three of Chris Paul, James Harden, and LeBron James, you miss out on Eric Gordon, who was a big part of what gave the Rockets so much success through that first Western Conference Finals run in the first place. Yeah,
that's a big loss. I mean, we might kind of underrate what Eric Gordon was then now. But yeah, he was that occasionally 20-25 points a night off the bench. And he sort of sparked that second unit for us every night when we needed to rest James Harden. And I think when they were staggering James and Chris, and we had Eric running with that second unit, that was as good as some starting units in the league. And so, yeah, that's a huge loss. I think replacing him with LeBron James and here's my thing, right? If LeBron James is on the Rockets, does Carmelo Anthony now buy into his role as sort of like less of a main player, more of a role player? Does he kind of take that offensive production out of what would have been in Eric Gordon's hands? And does he take responsibility for that now? And I think that with LeBron there, with Chris Paul there, with 3/4 of the banana boat there, I think he does. I think he's more accepting to play a background player role than he is now. So, yeah, it didn't work out in reality with Carmelo for, I'm sure, a number of reasons, including what his role was. But I think that role would have been better defined and more acceptable to him if LeBron was the one sort of giving it to him. Because then you're looking at, instead of it just being Chris Paul's voice in that locker room trying to get Melo to buy in, and suddenly you've got Chris Paul and LeBron. It's like, come on, man, like we can make something happen here, but you gotta really buy into what we're trying to get you to do here. And it's crazy that we've seen Carmelo Anthony kind of buy into that role in recent years, because it's the exact role that the Rockets wanted him to have, and he's still he took that year off, and then he bought into it. He had to do some soul searching, right? He did a year abroad, and he was just like, you know what, I've seen what's out there. It sucks. So let me come back and actually be good at what I can be good at, which is hit threes and still be a turnstile defensively. But that's neither here nor there. I do love that idea, right? Is, you get Carmelo Anthony, maybe he's a bit more bought into the role. It's kind of crazy to think that the Houston Rockets would be they'd be so top heavy had this trade gone through, because you'd have CP, James, LeBron, and Clint. Like, that is one hell of a starting four. It almost doesn't matter who your fifth is, but in this case, your fifth would still be PJ Tucker. Like, that's an absurd starting five. It's just the absolute lack of depth after those guys would be so, like, it would be a chasm between who your fifth best player is and then who your sixth best player is on that Rockets roster. Yeah, I mean, what are you looking at after that, right? You got Carmelo coming off the bench, Michael Carter-Williams. Who else was on that team? You can't even, Daniel House Jr. maybe never actually gets picked up, right? Because he got brought in midway through that season because they were so down horrendous that year and they needed all the help they can get. Maybe we never actually discover, Daniel House Jr. as like the prodigal Houston son returning to the lineup, that kind of thing. Yeah, and that was the year right? That he was going to get that extension. He ended up having to not play games because his two-way contract got used up, right? The games on his two-way contract. But yeah, the rest of that team is Iman Shumpert, Austin Rivers. Like you're kind of stretched thin once that starting unit is sitting on the bench. But I think going back to something you said earlier, if you've got LeBron James and James Harden and Chris Paul on a team, I think you start to attract those ring chasers now who can sort of give you that depth. And Morey already liked doing that, where he would get the star by any means and then surround them by whoever he could. And that was sort of his MO, right? He liked to really go after the top heavy teams or emulate those top heavy teams because stars win you championships.
I was curious because I wanted to go look and I immediately thought, okay, well, who were, I wanted to go see who the Warriors wound up scraping up that offseason as far as, ring chasing vets. And it completely just blast from the past, right? They signed DeMarcus Cousins that offseason.
Yeah, that was that offseason off of the injury. And that's when everyone was like, all right, great. They were overpowered before. They're just unstoppable now.
And then that one I'm not mattering nearly as much as we thought it would in the grand scheme of things, but it's crazy to think, right? Maybe, right, had this actually transpired, if you have all this star power allocated in Houston, what other ring chasing vets would ultimately decide to want to come the Rockets' way to play with that big trio of LeBron, Chris Paul, and James Harden. Now, I am so, As hyped as I would have been about these three guys playing together, I think there would have been some serious growing pains, like, up front in the very beginning, as far as these three guys like coexisting on the floor with one another, because you have three guys who are at their absolute best when they have the basketball in their hands. And at the end of the day, talent will figure it out, right? Like guys who are that talented would have been able to play together. But is it a stretch, or maybe I don't think I'm off base here, Raj, to think that team would have been, had they made it to the postseason, right? And it's not a question of if they would have made it; they would have made it there. But I don't think they would have been like a regular season juggernaut, right? They would have been like, they were gonna go through the motions of the regular season, have some guys missing some games. CP3 would have missed time. James probably missed a little bit of games here and there, maybe nothing major. He was kind of an Iron Man up to that point in his career. LeBron was probably going to miss some time. They'd probably finish somewhere in like the 4 to 5 seed range, honestly, because in their minds, it probably would have just been like, all right, we just need to get to the playoffs and then we're fine from that point on.
Yeah, I think 2 points on that. So like you said, in line with other LeBron teams, I think that the regular season would have been coasting to the playoffs and probably conserving the top heaviness of the team as much as possible. James Harden really never had that issue. He's kind of 110% at that point, 110% all the time. The unguardable tour, all of that through the regular season. And now, unfortunately, he's known as a regular season juggernaut exclusively. But I think something important to note is that was the year that Chris Paul sort of declined, right? After that 7-game series with the Warriors, he came back that next year and just wasn't the same. And he hadn't gone vegan yet. And so I think they would have underperformed a little bit compared to expectations, just because the real Rockets did too. I think adding LeBron guarantees them a playoff spot, obviously. But I think, kind of a hot take, I don't think it guarantees a championship, just because Chris Paul wasn't the same that year. And, KD Warriors are still the KD Warriors, man. They're lethal. There was a reason we're still so attached to the idea of winning that 7-game series. It's because it would have been the greatest feeling to beat that team. So I don't think, like you said, regular season juggernauts, maybe not. Playoff juggernauts, also maybe not. But it would have been fun.
That would have been, wow. That's, I honestly, I came into this thinking, they might have been, lauded as favorites ahead of the Warriors, with that acquisition. But I think you're right. I think that the way that the Warriors were kind of built, they had all that crazy depth. Like we just haven't ever seen a team that was assembled the way that they were with the cap favorability, the way that things spiked, the way that they were able to add KD without losing anything of substantive value to gain a player of that quality, right? In this scenario, the Rockets are giving up arguably at times their second best player in Eric Gordon, right? On any given night, he could have been their second best player, depending on how good or how bad, one of James or Chris Paul was. He was, borderline all-star. So to give up that, as well as all of those picks to have that opportunity to pair LeBron with CP and Harden, it would be that team's absolute top ceiling potential would be sky high, but the ability for them to realize that potential might not have actually been able to come to fruition, depending on the ancillary pieces you put around them. Yes, you still have Clint Capella. Yes, you still have PJ Tucker. We can talk about who they might have had coming off the bench here in just a moment, as far as different names that they had to, potentially cobble around those guys and what it would look like potentially, in a reset of that eventual Western Conference semifinal series against the Warriors, in which the Rockets did ultimately lose in 6 games. I kind of want to take a look at that and what that series would have looked like and what the aftermath of that one season in Houston could have potentially done to the Houston Rockets. We're going to get there in just a moment after a quick message from our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your sports betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and game. Find reviews and news for every single league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, UFC, boxing, MMA, you name it. They've got you and everything covered over at BetOnline. Right now, you can take a look at the odds for the title favorites going into next season, the Boston Celtics, plus 400 to win the chip next year in the NBA. You got the Milwaukee Bucks at plus 550, and the Golden State Warriors at plus 700. So for all of that and more odds, head to betonline.net to see the trends in action available to you. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. And final segment here at Locked on Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, appreciate you for checking out the show. We are free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. Be sure to search us up on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff. Now, Raj, you mentioned it there a minute ago. Maybe the Rockets, right? They truck through the regular season. They've got their ragtag group, as is every team that's ever had LeBron on its roster, right? You've got the ring chasing vets. You've got this ragtag group of guys around this trio of talent between LeBron, CP3, and Harden. Let's say they make it to the playoffs. Let's just try to keep things somewhat similar here, and we'll say, you know what? They make it to the first round. They wax the Jazz. Cool. That's nothing new. They make it to that Western Conference semifinals against the Warriors. Do you think they come out of that series on top with that core group of guys? So we're looking at a Houston Rockets roster, and I'll say we'll just have to go with, we'll give them a top 8. How's that? Because we can't give them Amon Shumpert, because Shumpert was part of the eventual Brevin Knight deal, and Brevin Knight was part of the Ryan Anderson deal. So he's gone. Amon Shumpert, there's no mid-tier salary to trade for him at the trade deadline that season. So let's say we give them, we give them the starting 5, CP3, Harden, PJ Tucker, LeBron, Clint Capella. Off the bench, you still got the mayor himself, Gerald Green. Let's say Carmelo Anthony buys into his newfound role on this Rockets team, and just for fun, we'll say that the Rockets actually got some decent minutes out of, Gary Clark and Isaiah Hartenstein, right? Being forced to play some of the young guys on the roster by necessity. How do you feel about that lineup going up against the Warriors?
Well, I think Mike D'Antoni won't like the idea of having to play Gary Clark or Isaiah Hartenstein. But I think that team stands a good chance. I think it depends really on how does Chris Paul play. Again, because let's call it 2 washes, right? We'll say LeBron washes KD, and Harden and Curry wash out. Let's call those 2 even. But you still got Clay and Draymond, and let's not forget that Kevon Looney gives Clint Capella trouble. That happened for whatever reason. It happened. So now you really depend on Chris Paul making up for Klay Thompson. You depend on PJ Tucker making up for Draymond Green, and you got to hope Clint Capella isn't afraid of Kevon Looney anymore. And I think those 3 could go either way each game, the winner of that matchup. I think where it gets interesting is the bench. I think even with the lack of depth, I think Carmelo is lethal off the bench at that point. Because if he's not sitting and watching games from the sidelines in civilian clothes that year, he buys into a role. I feel like that's a lethal potential 20, 25 points a night. And in the playoffs, I feel like Carmelo is underrated. He got that Denver team to the playoffs every year. And they performed. They were pretty good. They got to a Western Conference Finals, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I think that it comes down to the bench really, and those sort of not like fringe starter. What am I trying to say? The other three, not the superstars. James Harden, LeBron James, KD, and Steph Curry. I'll call them a wash, but the other three are what's going to decide that series.
Yeah, the bench players there, right? And there were a few other names that the Rockets wound up picking up along the way, right? I mean, they had Kenneth Faried, they had Austin Rivers. So like maybe those are guys that are still, gettable given how the season actually transpired. Because I was thinking back to players that were acquired via trades that could have no longer happened in this hypothetical, splintered off timeline. And I'm trying to make sure I have all my ducks in a row here. Try not to double up.
Does AD go to the Lakers still?
Well, I mean, that's where it gets really interesting as we kind of look at what would happen, after this series. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it could have gone almost either way. There's not really a guarantee. Like we think, LeBron paired up with James Harden and Chris Paul. It's, suddenly the Rockets are, we're talking about rings on rings on rings in Houston. I don't think it's that necessarily that simple. And if it's not, I mean, maybe they win the series, maybe they make it to Western Conference Finals or even to the finals, but maybe they struggle with the Toronto Raptors, right? Who were the eventual champions that year anyways, right? That was a good Raptors team. Maybe they're not the favorites in that series. And if that's the case, if you've got LeBron on a 1-year rental, I mean, we could do probably an entire podcast, shout out to Skip Bayless, generational hater, on what that would do to tarnish LeBron's legacy if he were to just come to Houston to try and win an easy ring with his friend Chris Paul for a season. But thinking about the ripple effects that would have had on the rest of the NBA, right? You bring up the AD thing. Does AD still get traded to LA if they don't have LeBron, and if they, don't have LeBron demanding that they find him a co-star to actually make LA relevant again? Are LA the eventual title winners in the bubble? Does COVID even happen if this trade happens? You know what? This is what happened.
LeBron to blame for COVID?
LeBron is the reason COVID happened. There we go.
Let's ask Skip Bayless.
More on Undisputed tomorrow morning.
Who drafts Zion? Because it's not going to be New Orleans, right?
Oh man, that is crazy. Like
things start to get weird.
That's the crazy thing to me is the entire fabric of the NBA world would have unraveled with this one little, like you talk about butterfly effect, and this is like a gigantic butterfly effect for what would have happened in the NBA had LeBron decided to ultimately come down to Houston, team up with Chris Paul and James Harden. And the fact that at the time I had convinced myself, Raj, I told myself, you know what? That'd be guaranteed rings for LeBron, pairing up with two players of that caliber. But now, after kind of talking through it a little bit, I really don't think it would have been guaranteed rings. And so maybe from a legacy standpoint, I hate to say it, but maybe LeBron was right in just choosing LA as the team that he wanted to go and really like finalize, cement his legacy, whatever, even though now there's, question marks about where he's going to go to try and play with Bronny Jr. But at least for now, it looks like LA will be his final stopping point as a player. And maybe that was the right decision. Maybe it wasn't. He ultimately won a chip with AD. But in this timeline, there's one more thing to be thankful for in this timeline. Can you guess what it is?
Where LeBron does go?
Oh yeah, where LeBron goes to Houston. Maybe, and even if he dips after one season of being in Houston, there's still something to be grateful for. Can you spot what it is yet?
We got out of the Ryan Anderson contract?
I mean, well, they still got out of the Ryan Anderson contract anyways. The Russell Westbrook Chris Paul trade would have never happened. Because they would have had no first round picks to deal Chris Paul in the first place.
I don't know about that, Jackson. Oh, you're right. You're right. The picks would have been gone. I was thinking
because they're all sitting in Cleveland.
If there was anybody more likely to ship out a weakened Chris Paul than Daryl Morey or James Harden, it would be GM. He would be like, I love you. You're my banana boat brother, but you're Oklahoma City Thunder now.
We would have also, been robbed of the Unguardable tour. Like,
Yeah.
that was, look, even though that season had its ups and downs, and like that 2018, 2019 year was ultimately kind of disappointing for how it ultimately ended, and then the aftermath of the season, and we're still kind of dealing with the repercussions from that in today's present day current timeline, not this splintered off, adjacent timeline where LeBron made it to Houston. Like, looking back on all that, that was a fun year. And Unguardable Tour is some of the best basketball that I think a lot of us have ever witnessed. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, for those of us that watched James Harden that year and know what he was capable of on a nightly basis, I think most of us realized that we're probably never going to get the chance to watch something like that again on that level of dominance. I mean, so, okay, just for reference, I ran a simulation right before we recorded on Basketball GM, and I wanted to see what the numbers would shake out to if you had LeBron and Chris Paul and James Harden on the same team. Chris Paul drops to 15 points a game, 5 assists, reasonable numbers. He's still gonna, that insane basketball IQ paired with LeBron's insane basketball IQ, there's still gonna be impact there, no doubt. LeBron, 25 points a night. I think it was like 7 rebounds, 7 assists. Like, cool. That's a LeBron stat line, 25, 7, and 7.
that's solid.
James Harden averaged 36 points a game, 10 rebounds, and 10 assists. And I was like, and Basketball GM is pretty conservative with its like ratings that it gives out. And I think he was like, it was still 38 minutes a night. And he was just dropping a casual, triple double every night. So that Unguardable Tour, with or without LeBron, I think was special to watch. Not getting LeBron ended up getting us Jalen Green ultimately, and I'm happy with that. So I think things shook out just right.
I was about to say that's what kind of brings us back to our main timeline, right? Where we live in this current reality. I will say though, I mean, the idea of a LeBron James Harden pick and roll though is kind of tantalizing to think about. We never got to see it in this reality. Maybe there's an alternate reality where Raj is hosting LOR and I'm the longtime listener and fan who jumps into the show to talk about a what if scenario if LeBron had never been traded to Houston. Would the Houston Rockets have drafted Jalen Green? That would have been all kinds of fun. But should I do a Built Bar read right now? Yeah, I'd say yes, but I don't want to get in trouble with anybody, any of the higher ups. So we're gonna hard pass on that. But with that, you should know the drill as a longtime listener. Let everybody know where to track you down at.
So you can find me on Twitter. At Reezy Season, REEZYSZN. That's pretty much all I do. So come chit chat with me. Come yell at me for saying that we wouldn't win a championship with LeBron. Whatever you want to do. Let's talk basketball. I love talking basketball.
Appreciate you for stopping by the show, my guy. It's been a pleasure. We're gonna bring you back for a non-what if episode in the not so distant future.
Thanks for having me, Jackson. This was fun.
That's going to do it for our What If edition of Locked On Rockets today. As always, appreciate you for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, the Odyssey app, free and available on all platforms. And we're on YouTube. Be sure to check us out on YouTube. Go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.